Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Canadian Association for Refugee and Forced Migration Studies CARFMS webinar on the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees UNHCR's Global Trends in Forced Displacement 2025 report. My name is Aziz Rahman. I am an assistant professor of criminal justice in the Department of Social Sciences at Texas A&M International University, Laredo, Texas, and I have the pleasure of chairing today's session. My passion for the topic stems from my doctoral research on the economic integration of resettled refugees in Canada, based in the University of Manitoba, and my postdoctoral research on refugee entrepreneurship at Toronto Metropolitan University. The United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR, released its most recent report on June 11, when we are going to have today's conversation just a few days after we observed World Refugee Day on June 20th. We are also having this conversation at a time when refugee protections face increasing restrictions and cuts to humanitarian assistance are leaving millions of displaced people without adequate support. So today we have an excellent mix of experts who will be speaking on the report. The 54-page report starts with an extensive executive infographic, trends at a glance, and it has 6 chapters. The first chapter on global forced displacement, overview, changes, protected refugee situations. Then next chapter on refugees, the next one internally displaced refugees, next one on asylum trends, and then next one on solutions, and last one on statelessness. After our speakers' presentations, we will have a Q&A, but you can post your questions in the chat box. I will read out to the speakers at the end, and also I'll invite you to use your microphone to speak during the Q&A. So now I will briefly introduce our speakers. Our first speaker is Tracey Maulfair, representative in Canada, UNHCR. Prior to this role, she has held numerous significant positions within the organization, including deputy representative in Lebanon, senior policy and guidance coordinator in Geneva, senior policy advisor in New York, and assistant representative in Pakistan. Her career with UNHCR began in 2001, and she has since served in various capacities across the globe, including in Namibia, Libya, Liberia, and Turkey. Before joining the United Nations, she practiced law in the United States, with early career experiences at Human Rights Watch in Zimbabwe and the Center for Reproductive Rights in Kenya. Mrs. Maulfair has a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from Pennsylvania State University and a Juris Doctor in International Human Rights Law from New York University. She has extensive experience leading UNHCR's protection and humanitarian work, and today she will provide an overview of the year's report, hopefully. Our next speaker is Professor Maureen Silcoff from the Lincoln Alexander School of Law at Toronto Metropolitan University. She specializes in refugee and immigration law. She has practiced immigration and refugee law exclusively since 1988. In addition to her private practice, she served for 5 years as a member of the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada, adjudicating refugee claims. Maureen is at the forefront of high-impact litigation addressing systemic issues in Canadian immigration and refugee regime. Alongside her public interest practice, Maureen represents individuals in complex immigration and refugee applications. Our last speaker is Professor James C. Simeon from York University. He is a professor at School of Public Policy and Administration, Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. He is a former head of the McLuhan College, a former acting director and deputy director at the Center for Refugee Studies at York University. Professor James Simeon is internationally recognized for his scholarship on refugee law and international protection. James will provide commentaries on the report from refugee law and public scholarships lens, hopefully. So we are fortunate to have an outstanding panel representing UNHCR, refugee law, and public policy. Now I would like to invite the speakers. The first, Tracy, please. It's your floor now. Tracy? Mm.
Sorry, Tracy, I think got booted out and she just came back in.
Okay, great. So Tracy, now it's your floor.
Yeah, sorry about that. We lost the internet, which actually never happens in this office except for the most inopportune time. So my apologies to everyone for that. And thank you for having me today. It's a nice opportunity to be able to join this conversation. As Aziz said, our report just came out last week, and I think some of the findings we're going to talk about today, I think you're going to find interesting. But let me start. I missed a lot of what Aziz said, so this might be a refresher and it might be something new. But let me start with a quick quiz. Now, don't panic. It's one question. And when we think about forced displacement globally, right, which region of the world do you think hosts the largest number of forcibly displaced people? I'm not gonna make you answer, but I mean, give it a little thought. I mean, is it Africa, where we immediately think about, is it Asia with the Rohingyas and everything that's happening, the Middle East, consistent state of turmoil there for the past 2 years? Is it the Americas, where we are living right now? I think the answer might surprise some of you in the fact that it is the Americas, which has not or does not immediately come to mind for most people when we talk about forced displacement. So to understand why, we have to look at a broader picture in this, one which became more complicated last week with the devastating earthquake in Venezuela. The America now hosts about 1 in 5 displaced people worldwide. Huge numbers. It's the largest host region globally. And even before the earthquake, a significant part of this was due to the situation in Venezuela and the large number of displaced Venezuelans. More than 6 million people from Venezuela are currently in need of international protection. That number's gone up since last week. This is the number from the report. And we don't actually have complete figures on the new displacement in Venezuela yet. Emergency assistance is being provided. UNHCR is there. We are working with IOM on emergency shelter and emergency assistance, but the situation is very fluid. So back to the stats, 97% of these people that are displaced in the Americas are hosted within Latin America and the Caribbean. So as soon as we say the Americas, a lot of people think, oh, that's because the US and Canada, right? Not really. Not really. It's part of it. Countries like Colombia, Peru, Brazil, Chile, and Ecuador have actually shown extraordinary leadership in the past decade in hosting and providing sort of solutions at temporary or longer term for these people who are displaced. And it reflects something we see globally, but in this region, we're seeing it as well, is that most refugees stay close to home. In Canada and particularly in the US, the picture is that actually all refugees come here. It's not really the case. Most refugees, 97%, are staying in the regions and within neighboring countries. They're staying in neighboring countries that often have limited resources, but show remarkable solidarity. At the same time, as I've been saying, the situation in the Americas is evolving. In 2025, Canada welcomed 38,800 refugees through resettlement and complementary pathways. This is one of the highest number globally, and it is something that we should commend Canada for. It's an important example of international responsibility sharing in practice, right? We're seeing it happen here. However, numbers will tell you only part of the story, because really what we're talking about is people given opportunities. In that way, I'd like to share with you one example of a very, very remarkable woman. Her name is Noor Utayam. She fled Syria as a refugee, as a child, and she arrived in Canada in 2017. She had very limited means, but she had a clear goal. She wanted to become an airline pilot, right? She took out a loan, she studied hard, and she worked hard towards that dream. And today, she flies as a pilot for Air Canada, the flagship airline in the country. She flies on the international routes, and she's the first female refugee commercial pilot in Canada, and one of only 3 in the entire world. Her story is exceptional, but in many ways it's not. Because when refugees are given safety and opportunity, they contribute and they succeed, and they strengthen communities around them. This is something UNHCR Canada explored recently in a report that we've done called Refugees Are Good for Canada. I don't know if everybody saw it, but this was a report we compiled based on Canadian census data. So we didn't make up the figures, we took what's available out there. And the findings are really very clear. Refugees strengthen the workforce. They support essential sectors. Their incomes grow over time as they're here. And the overwhelming majority become citizens and active members of society. 1 in 3 volunteers in the communities that welcome them in Canada. This should lead us to a broader shift in how we think about displacement. And in doing so, it should require a different response. As I mentioned before, refugees are all over the world, but they're also in cycles of displacement, right? They're 97% are in neighboring countries in exile. And not everyone's been given the same opportunities that are available here in Canada. However, if they are, it can change the situation. Recently, we got a new High Commissioner. His name is Dr. Barham Saleh. And he, upon coming into office about 6 months ago, looked around at the status quo of protracted displacement and said, this is not sustainable or acceptable. As a result, he's launched a new vision, which is called the 50 by 35 vision. This is a goal for the organization to reduce by half the number of refugees in protracted displacement who remain dependent on humanitarian assistance in the next decade. Reduce by 50% the number of refugees who remain in protracted displacement and dependent on aid by 50% by 2035. This moves beyond emergency response toward inclusion, livelihoods, and opportunity. And it's highly relevant for the Americas. Across the region, we're already seeing important elements of this approach in some of the countries I mentioned, Brazil, Ecuador, Canada. We're seeing regularization pathways, access to labor markets, inclusion in education and health systems, These are not only protection measures, but they're investments in self-reliance. However, there is one area where the global gap is particularly clear and remains, and that's resettlement. New UNHCR projections show that 2.4 million refugees will need resettlement in 2027. Yet, in 2025, so last year, only about 37,000 were resettled through UNHCR supported pathways. This gap is very significant. Even before recent declines, the international community had set a target of 130,000 resettlement places by 2027. Current trends suggest that goal will not be reached. Resettlement is not only a protection tool, it's central to international responsibility sharing. It helps relieve the burden on host communities, and it provides a pathway for people to rebuild their lives. As we think about the 50 by 35 vision, resettlement remains a critical tool, especially for those who cannot return and face the greatest risks. Let me close what I'm saying today with a very, very simple reflection. The global trends helps us understand where we are today, but it also points to a broader question. Not only how many people are displaced, but how we respond. And at a time when the right to seek asylum is being challenged in many, many parts of the world, we need to be clear about what is at stake. The right to seek safety is not an abstract concept. It is universal. It is one of the foundations of the international human rights system, and it is something that ultimately protects us all. Because no one is truly safe until the most vulnerable among us are safe. That is why welcoming refugees and supporting their inclusion is not only an obligation under the 1951 Convention, it's also a moral imperative. And it's an investment in our communities, in our economies, in our shared future, and in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tracy, for sharing your insights, reflections, highlighting some of the regional trends and stories with numbers, and of course, gaps in terms of different aspects, including the refugee resettlement needs. So now I want to invite Maureen. Please, Maureen, now is your floor.
Thank you. I'll just put my slides up, and it's a pleasure to be here and take part in this discussion. What I thought I would do is share my thoughts on the report in the form of discussing Canada's trends in forced displacement in 2025 and the current year, 2026. Because as I reviewed UNHCR's Global Trends report, I kept thinking back to Canada's role in this global landscape. And especially, my thoughts went to the fact that it is no secret that the government has proactively announced that one of its immigration objectives is actually to restrict immigration to Canada in 2026 and the coming years. So as a result, I want to focus on 8 developments or trends in Canadian refugee and refugee-related matters. I think these 8 trends or developments deserve attention, especially because the cumulative effect offers insight into Canada's current perspective on forced displacement. So I'll start with refugee sponsorship and resettlement. I agree with Tracey that Canada's world leadership in refugee resettlement or sponsorship in 2025 is hugely significant, coming in at close to 40,000 individuals, and this deserves recognition, especially in light of the other countries. And so we see the next country on the list is Australia with less than half, and it just goes down from there. But I think this also has to be taken alongside some of the restrictive measures. So we've seen that the groups of 5 and community sponsorships under the privately sponsored refugee programs have been paused until the end of this year, so December 31st, 2026. We also know that the sponsorship agreement holders operate, but the numbers are quite limited. And I think we can understand what's happening when we look at the levels of immigration that the Canadian government announced back in November 2025, because it sets out the following policy objective. It says, quote, the new levels plan reduces the number of temporary residents, taking back control over the immigration system, and putting Canada on a trajectory to bringing immigration back to sustainable levels. But it also states that Canada will continue its long tradition of welcoming those who are fleeing violence, persecution, and displacement. Yet we see the numbers are limited. So, for example, 49,000 levels projected for refugees from abroad and for protected persons. So that's down from 76,000, for example, in 2024. I'm also noticing, and I don't have statistics on this, but anecdotally, my colleagues and I are noticing more and more rejections by RRCC in terms of, for example, groups of 5 sponsorships over minor matters, technical grounds, matters of omission that are couched as credibility or perhaps misrepresentation. So this does represent a troubling trend. Second, I'd like to address Interim Federal Health Program, IFHP. So Canada has introduced a new copay policy that threatens access to medical care. We saw a program in 2012 that was put in place and then declared unconstitutional by the federal court. These new cuts are different because they leave in place basic health coverage, unlike the previous cuts, but there is a copay. The copay was announced in the budget 2025. The copay came into force on May 1st. And there's 2 main elements. One is a 30% copay for supplemental services. So these are things like devices, for example, prosthetics, wheelchairs, mental health supports, dentists. So someone has an abscessed tooth, for example, and a number of other supplementary forms of health care. And as well, there's a $4 dispense fee for prescriptions. And so that might not seem like a lot for people who are on very limited incomes with numerous family members, and they are on several prescriptions, especially that change over time. It can be quite significant. This impacts people in the Canadian refugee system, so refugee claimants, but also government-assisted refugees, people who have arrived here under that program. The government indicated that it had to put this in place to divert money for defense spending, that the healthcare costs soared because of the refugee backlog. And notably, as a matter of policy, we were told that UNHCR's policy is that health coverage in a host nation for refugees should be at least equivalent to those of citizens. But here we're told by the Canadian government there was an imbalance. Refugees and refugee claimants got better health coverage than Canadians. So they had to cut this to comply with UNHCR standards. And interestingly, there is no evidence that we can see so far that there's been any health impact studies. So what would be the consequence of these cuts? The government doesn't appear to have looked into it. So the medical practitioners anticipate very serious harm. So for example, a child who needs feeding tubes, a child who needs a prosthetic, would now perhaps be stuck in the hospital and not be able to receive home care because they can't afford the 30% copay. Individuals who are, as I mentioned, multiple drug prescriptions will have a problem with the copay. Another example, mental health treatments, and especially for people in the refugee system, we know how important this is. It's now limited to 10 sessions per year. And this is aside from the copay. So it makes it inaccessible for a significant number of individuals. Many medical associations have issued public statements directed towards the immigration minister to cancel the policy. For example, the Canadian Medical Association said that when patients can't afford prescriptions or supplemental care, it only increases the cost to the province because they end up in hospitals in the emergency department, and it makes overall the healthcare system much more expensive. So litigation on this front is now being explored and expected to happen. The third trend or development has to do with C12 ineligibility. So Canada has put in place a new law that for individuals who have delayed more than a year after their first entry to Canada, you no longer can access the Immigration and Refugee Board's Refugee Protection Division for a hearing. You're now given a pre-removal risk assessment, which is on paper, unless you meet an exception of the officer deciding there's a credibility issue. But there is no mandatory hearing at all. The government's rationale is that these new eligibility requirements will reduce pressure on the asylum system and deter people from using the asylum system as a shortcut to immigration pathways. So this impacts not only people who have delayed making a claim, it's for people who've had multiple entries and there's certain cutoff dates. But if you came as a child before June 24th, 2020, and you're coming back in 2024, and you had, for example, student status, and then something happens in your country, you don't get a hearing. It also impacts people who've crossed the Canada-US border undetected, and they're coming forward with a claim more than 14 days after, so that they're permitted to stay here. They no longer have a hearing. There's particular impact on individuals who have experienced intimate partner violence or who identify as LGBTQ+, because of additional difficulties in coming forward within a year with their claim. People who make a surplus refugee claim, so there was no reason before the year to make the claim. People, as I mentioned, who might have been in Canada on study or work permits, and so they had another way to not go back to their country of persecution. And it's especially hard as well on people from moratorium countries, countries where Canada doesn't deport to, because they don't get served with a pre-removal risk assessment because they're not about to be removed. They're in legal limbo for possibly years and years and years, and even worse when they're separated from family members in their country of origin. So there has been a legal challenge started to that. There are now close to 300 individuals. This is based on different provisions of the Charter and the Canadian Bill of Rights. Okay, number 4 is the refugee backlog. We've all heard that there are close to 300,000 refugee claimants. Those numbers are pending before the board. Why did this happen? There's several reasons. All, I think, could have been possibly avoided. The board has been somewhat inflexible in terms of having some creative measures to put forward claims that don't need a full hearing. They could revert back to the expedited interview they used to have in the 90s. IRCC has decided not to implement any kind of refugee backlog program. Again, the experience from the 90s shows how successful that was. There is no regularization program that would perhaps be sector specific that would include refugees, also a problem. And finally, the elimination of temporary resident to permanent resident pathways did leave people who thought they didn't have to enter the asylum system without any opportunity to stay, even though they have a meritorious claim, they didn't need to assert it initially. So these are contributing factors to the backlog. Number 5, humanitarian compassionate application. So this is used for people, for example, if you didn't fall short of persecution, but you still have a serious problem, you're still found credible, etc. The problem is it's now projected to take between 10 and 50 years for a decision. So there's no protection against removal during this time period. We think it's tied to the levels, and it's also ripe for a legal challenge. It's especially problematic for children, for people with medical issues, including mental health issues. Okay, sorry about that. Family reunification is the 6th factor. So processing time could take up to 5 years. So you're determined to be a refugee, you apply for permanent residence, you include your dependents overseas, up to 5 years for this to be processed. It's in part tied to the low levels. There was a one-time public policy put in place by the government, but it's a bit of a band-aid solution. There's now been a class action started against the Canadian government, where the lawsuit asserts that Canada has obstructed the right to family reunification for refugee parents and their overseas children. And so that's something to watch for in the coming months, based again on the Charter, discrimination based on family status, and Section 7, the right to security of the person. Number 7, public policies. We've all seen public policies. We have them in place for various countries. Current ones deal with Afghanistan, Sudan, Gaza, Ukraine, etc. Some are for refugee resettlement, so people come as resettled refugees, as permanent residents. Others are for visitors' visas, so temporary. The issue with these policies is the government is often quick to announce the policies, but slow to operationalize them. And even when they are put in place, they're often ineffective and have road bumps that end up creating serious problems. So give you 2 examples. One example has to do with the context of Afghanistan. And I note that the UNHCR's report does talk about individuals from Afghanistan returning to the country, especially when their situation in their country of, I wouldn't call them the host country, they're often waiting to be removed somewhere else. So for example, Pakistan has decided to deport Afghans without status. So a large number have returned to Afghanistan. What we see in Canada is Canada has put in place policies to assist individuals who had a significant or enduring relationship to Canada. But there's 2 problems. One is Canada just didn't process a lot of applications. So people applied and heard nothing for years and years and years. We took those to court. We had some success. The problem is the government didn't change the policy. They're not looking at all those files. So if anyone wants to challenge, they have to have the wherewithal, the financial means, etc., to launch their own legal challenge. The other problem we're seeing with the Afghan situation is individuals who have arrived here as resettled refugees have what are called de facto family members who are being screened out for no valid legal reasons. So the policy included people, for example, who were dependent on the individual with a connection to Canada, especially if they live together. And we see the government now backtracking on that policy. And another example is the policy for Gaza, because we've seen a number of legal challenges. One was actually successful. Again, a similar context where the government failed to actually open people's applications and process them. That was successful. The government has now tried to appeal that. And again, anyone else who has to challenge has to do so on an individual level. Basis, because there's no indication the government has taken a look at their actual refusal policies. And then finally, the Safe Third Country Agreement. So the STCA, the United States remains designated as a safe third country. If the government would like to explain why, I would like to know, but it's all under lock and key. We don't know what their rationale is. We know a couple of years ago, the Supreme Court of Canada heard a challenge. They said, listen, we're concerned about some of the harms to people, but there are what they call safety valves. So you can come to the Canada-US border, seek consideration, for example, under humanitarian grounds, and all will be okay. Well, we know that it's not, because it's not effective. So that's one new legal challenge in place to these so-called safety valves. Another is that the court had never considered equality rights under Section 15 of the Charter. The Supreme Court said, look at that again. That's underway. And there's a third challenge to unlock the policies that have to do with Canada's obligation to conduct this continuing review. And that's a challenge that is underway. So we have 3 challenges underway. Again, it'll be some time before we get decisions, but I think that's all I'll discuss on these measures. But I just want to close by saying that when you stand back and look at all these 8 different changes, developments, trends, I think it does present a particular concern in terms of Canada's current landscape. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maureen. You enlightened us with the positive picture as well as critical dimensions in relation to sponsorship, resettlement, new immigration policies, even the third STCA. So thank you so much. And our last speaker, James, and now it's your turn, please.
Well, thank you very much, Aziz, for the introduction. It's a real pleasure to be with everyone. I'm going to be taking a very different approach. I want to start off by thanking UNHCR for its reports. Like many other academics, I'm really dependent on the reliable statistics that are provided by UNHCR on an annual basis. I rely on these for my research. I'm sure others do as well as governments. But what I'd like to do in the 15 minutes that I have for my presentation, and I'm going to go through this rather quickly to try to get through all my slides, is look at the pervasiveness of war or protracted armed conflict in the world today. As you're probably aware, or most people are aware, organized political violence is increasing and becoming more complex and harder to resolve. I want to look at the causal relationship between war, terrorism, and forced displacement. As everyone's aware, there's a direct causal relationship between war and displacement, but there's also a relationship between war, terrorism, and displacement, and I'll touch on that. And I'm going to incorporate portions of the global trends in forced displacement in 2025 to illustrate these elemental relationships. And as everyone's aware, most of the forced displacement in the world today comes from a limited number of countries. And all of these countries are in protracted armed conflict situations. Now, Tracey did mention Venezuela and the situation in South America. I'll touch upon that as well, but obviously that may be an exception. So the Global Trends reports, UNHCR is committed to achieve durable solutions, and I'm very pleased you talked about the 5035 vision and goal of the new High Commissioner for Refugees. But I would argue that these are really dealing with the symptoms of the problem, and they're not addressing the root causes. And the principal cause of forced displacement is, as we all know, wars and armed conflicts. And here is where I'll make a plea. And that plea is that the most durable solution would be sustainable peace, which is, of course, the ultimate goal of the United Nations. And I'll conclude with a final plea at the end And hopefully UNHCR might incorporate more information in terms of addressing what the UN is dealing with respect to war, terrorism, and forced displacement. So let me just remind you all in terms of the situation today with respect to protracted armed conflict. The ICRC, International Committee of the Red Cross, has pointed out that there are approximately 130 armed conflicts that are taking place in the world today, and that's twice as many armed conflicts that are taking place than 15 years ago. And to quote the UNHCR, over 130 armed conflicts are raging in the world today, twice as many as 15 years ago. And these are lasting longer, growing more complex, and trapping entire generations. If you look at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, PRIO, they reported in their most recent conflict trends report that there are 61 conflicts taking place across 36 countries, and that was in 2024. And in fact, PRIO is arguing that there's been a structural shift that has been taking place, and there's far more violence and fragmentation that is taking place in the world. And they point out that 2024 marked a grim new record, the highest number of state-based conflicts in over 7 decades. And PRIO also noted and made a very important point, looking beyond, obviously, what's popular in the media in terms of the Russian-Ukraine war and the Gaza wars, that there's been a multiplication of conflicts in individual countries. So half of the countries that are involved in armed conflicts face one or more state-based conflicts, and in 9 countries, as a matter of fact, there are 3 or more state-based conflicts that are taking place. Conflicts are becoming more layered, transnational, and increasingly more difficult to end. And the major wars, as you're all familiar with, Russia-Ukraine war, that's now going into the 5th year. This is the largest conventional war in Europe since 1945, and 10 million Ukrainians have been forcibly displaced thus far in the war. If you look at the Sudan civil war, and that's taking place between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Response Force, that war is in the 4th year, and there are 12 million people that have been displaced in famine conditions. And this is considered one of the deadliest armed conflicts in the world today. And then we have the Gaza, Lebanon, and the Middle East front, if you will, and the devastation that has been taking place there. And that it's widened between Israel and Iran, but it's now escalated into the U.S., Israel, and Iran war. So far, there are 3.9 million displaced in the region, and mainly in Iran and Lebanon. We have the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo and the fighting that's taking place over the mineral-rich areas, despite repeated peace agreements. Upwards to 9 million people have been displaced there. In Myanmar, there's been a fragmented civil war taking place there since 2021 coup, the 5th year of the conflict, 3.5 million people forcibly displaced. And then we have the escalation zones. So if you look at the Sahel, if you look at the collapse of the state in Haiti, the Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, these are shipping choke points, including the Red Sea, and these could flare up and ignite and become major conflicts as well. If we look at the causal relationship between war, terrorism, and forced displacement, wars obviously result in refugees. This is pretty self-evident. I think most people recognize this. Anytime a war erupts, of course, people flee this organized political violence. No one wants to be a casualty of war, whether it's due to persecution or the loss of the essentials in terms of water, food, medical supplies. But what's characteristic in terms of modern warfare is the deliberate targeting of civilians. And the causal relationship between war and forced displacement is quite obvious, but there is also a causal relationship between war, terrorism, and forced displacement. First, I think it's important to note that terrorist incidents largely take place in war and protracted armed conflict situations. So if you look at the Global Terrorism Index, the most recent report from the Institute of Economics and Peace, it states that terrorism remains highly concentrated Just under 70% of all terrorist incidents take place in only 5 countries: Pakistan, Burkina Faso, Nigeria, Niger, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. And 6 of the 10 countries most impacted, by terrorism are in the sub-Sahara Africa, and that's now the epicenter in terms of terrorism. And all of these countries, I don't need to point out, are in protracted armed conflict situations. So the correlationship between war, terrorism, and asylum is fairly clear. War and terrorism are intertwined, if you will. War creates instability, state collapse, and the grievances breed, of course, terrorism. And terrorism is a tactical method that's often used in asymmetrical warfare when opposed to stronger forces. But it's also important to stress that terrorism is the use of political violence, primarily targeting civilians, of course. The intention is to instill extreme fear to advance a particular cause, whether it's political, religious, or ideological. So the causal relationship, if you will, between war, terrorism, and asylum is that wars, of course, not only create displacement, but they also create terrorism. So my argument would be that terrorism accelerates the rate of forced displacement that is taking place. So wars result in forced displacement, but when there are wars and terrorism, this accelerates the number of people that are forcibly displaced. And the deliberate targeting of civilians, of course, takes place when there's ethnic cleansing and also in the cases of genocide. So if you're looking at the relationship between these 3 key variables, wars plus terrorism accelerates or intensifies mass forced displacement. So terrorism acts as the accelerant or the catalyst in terms of forced displacement. So if you look at the Global Trends and Forced Displacement Report of 2025, it illustrates these elemental relationships. 1 in every 70 people now is forcibly displaced in the world. Now, not everyone, of course, is forcibly displaced because of war or armed conflict, but the bulk of the displaced populations of the world, over 2/3, are the consequence of organized political violence, wars, or protracted armed conflict. And if you look at the Global Trends Report data and statistics that was released on June 11th, it summarizes the following 4 states: Sudan, 2.8 million refugees, 9.1 million internally displaced people, the largest displacement in the world. And as I indicated, this is the 4th year of the armed conflict in the Civil War. Democratic Republic of Congo, 3.9 million people newly displaced, 3.6 have returned, but in an armed conflict situation without humanitarian assistance. Syria, 4.9 million people living in continued insecurity, and despite the situation now in Syria, 1.3 million Syrians have returned, but their prospects are quite grim. And then in Afghanistan, you have 3.7 million people. 4 out of the 5 people are hosted in Iran and Pakistan, both in situations of protracted armed conflict. The Global Trends Report for 25 indicates that there are 7 countries that produce 70% of the world's forcibly displaced that come under the UNHCR mandate, along with people that need international protection: Afghanistan, South Sudan, Sudan, Syria, Ukraine, Venezuela. All of these countries are victims of protracted armed conflict. Now, Venezuela is a special case, of course, I'll grant you that, but don't forget that the United States invaded Venezuela on the 3rd of January 2026 and captured the president and his spouse, Nicolas Maduro and Celine Flores. So they have been a victim of war as well. And it's important to point out as well that 39% of the world's forcibly displaced are children. Now, this is a very troubling statistic, and it underscores the fact that we have a lost generation of children and they're handicapped by wars, protracted armed conflicts. Maureen mentioned a backlog. Now, there's a growing backlog in terms of pending decisions. In the United States, it's 3.7 million. In other countries, there are backlogs of pending decisions: Egypt, Peru, Canada, growing by 8%, Germany, and so on. So that's an ongoing issue as well. So let's look at some of the durable solutions. Well, one of the principal causes, if that's war and armed conflict, presumably what you would want to do is deal with that particular issue. And the United Nations is, of course, designed and primarily to do that through the UN Security Council, the General Assembly, the Secretary General. There are also departments of peace operations, depot, and there's also the that's responsible for the peacekeeping forces. You have the UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, and then you have other mechanisms as well, and I'll touch on those in a moment. UNHCR has 3 durable solutions. They are voluntary repatriation, local integration, and resettlement. But what about dealing with the primary cause in terms of wars and armed conflicts that are creating the displacement? And there is the Global Trends Report could provide more information, I think, in terms of what the UN is doing to try to end these wars and protracted armed conflicts, and also address the issue of terrorism, which is also the catalyst in terms of forced displacement. So here are some examples and suggestions in terms of what can be done. There are now 11 active peacekeeping operations in different parts of the world today. Many of these in countries that are producing the world's refugees. Why not identify what efforts the UN is undertaking in terms of these countries? What progress is being made in terms of the peacekeeping operations? So you have Sudan, South Sudan itself, Democratic Republic of Congo, Golan Heights, India, and Pakistan. So peacekeeping operations are very different than 1948 when they were first established by the UN. They not only are intended to protect people, but they're also intended to support nationally owned political solutions for processing and promoting peace and stability. So what's being done to address terrorism in war-torn regions? Well, there is a UN Office for Counterterrorism that provides leadership and coordination in terms of building capacity to actually implement the UN's counterterrorism strategy itself. There's also a UN Counterterrorism Center. Why not report on the UN's counterterrorism strategy in situations of mass forced displacement? And then you have the Secretary General's Peacebuilding Fund. And what is really interesting here is if you look at the countries that are producing the most refugees in the world, in fact, they've received peacebuilding funds. The Democratic Republic of Congo, $3 million so far in 2026, $9 million in 2025. South Sudan, $3.2 million, $9.4 million last year. Burkina Faso, $2 million. Central African Republic, over $18 million. Presumably, you would also want to take into consideration the UN Security Council's resolutions as well with respect to dealing with wars and protracted armed conflict. So some final reflections and thoughts. The number of wars and armed conflicts are increasing dramatically, as ICRC has pointed out. They're lasting longer, growing more complex, harder to settle. PRIO has emphasized the structural shifts that is taking place, that is obviously producing more refugees over time. There is a direct and immediate causal relationship, as I've already pointed out, between war, terrorism, and forced displacement. And the terrorism, as I've indicated, intensifies the mass forced displacement taking place. 6 countries account for 70% of the world's forcibly displaced. If you can address the conflicts that are taking place in those 6 countries, then you can solve many of the world's forcibly displaced. And of course, the main purpose of the United Nations, its chief responsibility is to maintain international peace and security. So they try to do this through a variety of different mechanisms, as I've indicated, the Security Council, the Department of Peace and Peace Operations, the Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, the responsibility for both peacekeeping and peacebuilding operations, the Office of Counterterrorism, the Secretary General's Peacebuilding Fund, and various resolutions of the Security Council. So shouldn't the UNHCR's Global Trends Report incorporate some of these activities of the UN and its various other organizations working to address the principal cause in terms of forced displacement currently in the world today, and that is making the peace, keeping the peace, and building the peace, and hopefully working towards a sustainable peace. So that's essentially my plea. The report's wonderful. I certainly hope that you continue to provide this, but hopefully look at other ways to incorporate information that can deal with the root cause of the forcible displacement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James, for giving us a detailed analysis of the symptoms, causes of forced displacement, as well as the intersections between the three variables: war, terrorism, and forced displacement. Now actually there is the time for the audience, but before we move to the Q&A, I want to give an opportunity to the speakers to respond to any points there could be arising. So yeah, if there is any point, Maureen, you want to address, Maureen or James raise, and vice versa. It would be brief before we move to. Yes, please.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. I think I just want to comment on James's plea. I think it's a good idea, truthfully. I think, talking more about the need for peace and what is being done and what more could be done is integral to trying to reverse the trends that are happening with forced displacement. So, point well taken. Unfortunately, I don't make the decisions on this, but I can commit to raising it with the people who do. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you. Okay, James and Maureen, do you have anything, any points raised by Maureen's presentation? Yes, please, James.
I have a question for Maureen. Maureen, you outlined the tendency, the direction that Canada's going in, and it's all negative. But if we look at the situation in the United States and we look at the situation in other countries around the world, would you say that Canada is not only keeping in line with that general trend of retrenching, if you will, refugee rights and protection, but where does it fit in globally? Is it leading the way? Is it somewhere in the middle? Or is it better than other countries?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and definitely Canada is much better than other countries, especially our neighbor south of the border. At the same time, I don't think we should be comfortable with the trends we're seeing. I think we have to be very careful for Canada not to engage in a race to the bottom. And honestly, when my colleagues and I talk to each other these days, it's a common issue. How are you? Well, it's a lot. This is overwhelming. We're back to 2012. These are common thoughts among people who work in immigration and refugee law. And that's what I'm finding quite troubling. So yes, we can measure Canada against other countries and say, well, Canada's not doing so bad. But what we should be doing is two things. I think measuring Canada against itself, against what it could be, and most importantly, against international human rights standards, and then take our cues from that.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Maureen, do you have anything to say to other speakers?
I think I'm happy to see if there's any questions and engage with the participants.
Okay, thank you so much. Now, actually, we are doing very good time-wise. We have around 30 minutes and we can take several questions. I don't see any questions on the chat box. So I would like to invite the audience to speak up. Yeah. So Ranu, please. Yeah, Renu? Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for all your presentations. I really appreciate it. Thank you, James, very, very much for raising incredibly important critical questions that need to be addressed. I know and thank you to the UNHCR for your data. Like James, I use it in my teaching, in my class presentations, always having every year changing my maps and over the years showing how forced displacement changes and then asking the students what they think are the root causes. Many of them are students themselves who are from, as James, in Toronto, we have a lot of students who are forced migrants and from different parts of so a lot of them, gaining this kind of using those sort of maps and trends and traditions to be able to bring discussion, debate, and so forth in terms of what do they think. And I think what James, I think that you brought this up is so important, needs to be brought up much more. I probably in every single discussion on the forced migration. I wanted to add also, and I'm so really glad that you brought the Latin American question as well in terms of Venezuela and what's happening in the rest of there. I'm also I think the question, aside from wars, which is different kinds of wars, is the question of sanctions and sanctions and tariffs and the impacts of that have strangled a lot of parts of the world. And that is not addressed directly, but the after effects are. But in terms of the root causes, I think sanctions, particularly, I work in Cuba, firsthand on the ground, 10 years over what sanctions does to a lot of parts of the world. I think the question of sanctions and economic, it's going to get worse and worse, I think. It's not getting any better. And I think, James, your last question on what is Canada's position in terms of other parts of the world sanctions. So I think the repercussions, not war, of course, and what James has pointed out in such great detail is really, really important, but also questions on sanctions that go parallel. And I mean, climate change, of course, what's happening in terms of climate change and environmental, as someone who's a geographer, environmental sustainability and all of that alongside that. So, but sanctions. So what are your thoughts and feelings and in terms of Maureen, even here in terms of what are the legal kind of responses to these kind of global shifts in sanctions and tariffs? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so James first, okay, maybe, or anybody.
Well, Radu, I agree with you, obviously, in terms of the importance of sanctions, particularly in the case of Cuba, and how it has a detrimental effect on people there, and of course, why it creates the displacement for people that want to risk their lives trying to make it to Florida or some other place in the United States. So all I can do is reinforce that. I don't know if there's an effective response in terms of what Canada might be able to do. I'll leave that to Maureen or others that might want to offer that. But I agree with your comments with respect to that.
Yeah, I mean, my thoughts on that, I have a couple of thoughts, I suppose. Canada has, as I've mentioned, put in place different public policies in response to humanitarian crises, but that presumes that those individuals could leave the country and come to Canada, right? And so we're dealing with very particular circumstances in Cuba. It doesn't mean that it might not be a good fit in other situations, but again, I think if Canada puts in place a public policy, it has to be much more than performative. It has to be workable. It has to be effective. People have to be able to access it. Otherwise, people get their hopes up, they apply, and then they're just left in limbo, in a way worse off because they could have given up other opportunities.
Sorry, I just wanted to interject. I wasn't thinking about coming in. I'm
Yeah.
thinking about for them to stay in their own place. Many of them don't want to leave, right? And so just
Yeah.
aid or financial aid there. Many
Yeah.
of them are happy there. They don't want to
Yeah.
leave. They just want to
Of
stay
course,
there,
of course.
right?
Yeah.
They don't want the sanctions, so just
Yeah,
more, not that $8 million, but more than that in terms of anyway. Yeah.
yeah, and yeah, again, I mean, from my perspective and the work I'm involved in, sometimes Canada does support individuals in those situations, but then it's to the detriment of the systems here, right? So they say, well, we don't need to accept refugees in Canada because look at what we've done abroad. So I think that has to be kept in mind too.
Wow, okay. So I think we have another questions from Emily. Emily, you can introduce yourself. I'm sorry, I did not ask before, but yeah. So Emily is there? Emily, I think you raised
Hello,
hand.
can you hear me?
Yes, please. Yeah.
I've just pasted my question in the chat. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto, and I wondered if any of the speakers, maybe particularly one of the first two, would like to comment on Canada's sort of apparently now defunct economic mobility pathway pilot. And the reason I asked about it specifically is because I think it was featured as quite a positive development in that Refugees Are Good for Canada report that you mentioned, Tracey. And I also wondered if it was another sort of negative development, to be added to Maureen's list. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay.
I'm happy to lead off on that one, if
Sure.
okay with you, Maureen.
Yes.
Yeah, so definitely we see this as positive. We have in the Refugees Are Good for Canada report showcased how it's positive and some of the good stories from it. And I am pleased to, I don't know if I'm giving away secrets or not. I think you're aware it was under evaluation. They've been evaluating the policy. There is an intention to continue it. It's not clear in what form. They're using the evaluation as a way of looking at it, because the problem with that is that it was very slow, and it was not meeting the needs of the employers as much as they wanted. So we don't know what it will look like, but the intention is to have an economic pathway in the future. And at the current time, even though they're not accepting any new applications, they are still working through the large backlog and still implementing the program slowly. So it's not all negative, and hopefully it will get more positive. But don't quote me on that, because I don't know if I just gave away information I wasn't supposed to.
Okay. Maureen, do you want to address?
Sure. So the issue of the slow pace of that program comes up in many of the other public policies. And I'm not sure what the specific cause is for the slowness in the EMPP, but often in these programs, it's security clearance, right? And it's a matter of waiting for security clearance, and that kind of bogs down the whole thing. So I don't know if that's one of the issues. I'm not sure how the government thinks it could speed things up, because often it depends on third parties to issue the security clearance. It depends on the country, of course, right? Because the MPP cover is not country specific. But that's my reflection on that situation.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we have Sophia now. Yeah, what's it?
Thank you so much. Thank you, James, Tracey, and Maureen, for your presentations. I apologize. I was a little bit late to the presentation, so this point might have been addressed. So please forgive me if that's the case. My question is for James, as James spoke directly to the causes of refugees, the creation of the refugee subject around the world, and how they are increasing due to increased conflicts and wars. My question is with regards to the UN incentives or initiatives to address conflict and mitigating conflict or reducing conflict around the world in the millions of dollars. And also that the 6 major countries that are producing the vast majority of refugees are Afghanistan, Syria, Venezuela, Ukraine, and with the exception of Sudan, which is receiving, it seems like, funds. How do you bring those 2 points together when you see the numbers and you see that the money that is being allocated to addressing issues of war are not actually being received by the countries that are actually producing the vast majority of refugees? How do you reconcile those 2 points? Or do you at all?
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Dr. Sophia Nuri. I'm an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia, and my area of research is refugee education.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, James or Maureen or Tracy?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. It's a very good one. I find it very hard to reconcile that. The United Nations, through its peacekeeping and its peace-building efforts, seem to have limited effect in terms of these armed conflicts. One of the things I didn't include in my presentation that I'm very interested in is that many of these conflicts are also driven in terms of benefiting from the conflict itself, as you're aware. So one of the arguments that I made before is that if you look at war, it's intimately connected in terms of the illicit arms trade. The illicit arms trade benefits directly from ongoing civil wars and conflicts. So if you look at the situation in Sudan as an example, I think there are rare minerals there. There's, I think it's gold, and other surrounding states are benefiting from the mining that's taking place there, and that's being then used to purchase illicit arms that, of course, feed the conflict itself. The forced displacement, of course, many people that arrive in host countries, asylum countries, have paid snakeheads, smugglers, traffickers, of course, are doing it. So they're benefiting directly from armed conflicts. So if you look at the criminology of war and armed conflict, the criminology of war and armed conflict actually drives, if you will, these conflicts. That's why we have endless wars. That's why there's protracted armed conflict. You have to look at the combatants, but you have to look at others who are benefiting from this. And that is, of course, the international organized criminal network. So yes, I'm providing you with sort of one perspective or view. And if you're looking at the criminology of war and armed conflict, you can look at all of the other drivers in terms of those that are benefiting from wars, that drive wars, and make it exceedingly difficult to end those wars. So how do you reconcile the two in terms of what the UN is confronting? Obviously, it's confronting, on the one side, the state officials that hopefully are operating on a legal basis within international humanitarian law, international criminal law. But of course, we know, and I'm not sure if you would agree with Emil Durkheim, who would say that crime is natural in society. There's always going to be a criminal aspect to it, and that criminal aspect is going to also be a factor. But if you don't weight that in terms of your strategy with respect to ending war, and you're not taking a real politique approach to it, then you're going to be missing a very important aspect of it.
I agree. Thank you so much. I think just to piggyback off of what Ranu was mentioning earlier with regards to the sanctions in some of these countries that are now trying to rebuild in a somewhat state of less violence, those sanctions have stayed in place and sometimes are very extreme to the point where these individuals within these countries, the citizens of these countries who are not, participating in the war directly or had not participated in the war directly, are trying to survive and live. And then you have this form of like collective punishment, which causes this economic issue, which causes, like, kind of feeds into the increase of refugees from these places. So, for example, in places like Syria, where now there's a decline in the amount of violence, or Afghanistan, where there's a decline in the amount of violence, sanctions and economic issues are still driving the refugee crisis, if you want to call it that. And those numbers are still staying very high, or what's happening in Venezuela. So I think for us in the field of education, where teachers are, dealing with huge number of students coming in from these parts of the world, and who don't actually understand what's happened, I find it somewhat like a little bit hard at times explaining, okay, well, these places have ended war, but yet we still have refugees coming from them. And I was curious if you have any response to that kind of question to anyone who presented today. And thank you again, James, for answering the first one.
I'll start on that one, if you want. I think what we see is that even though officially an armed conflict may be declared over and people lose interest, the attention of the media moves on, the essentials of reconstructing, of rebuilding, of helping a society start again are increasingly not happening. So the situation doesn't improve in the country, the economy doesn't improve, and people go back to nothing. That's what we're seeing in Syria. It's what we're seeing in Afghanistan. It's what we're seeing in Sudan. So the potential that people could be forced to move again remains quite high. It used to be that after a conflict ended, the international financial institutions, the development institutions would go in and really help rebuild. We're seeing less of that happening.
Is there a reason? Is it just the money factor, that they don't have the means to do it?
I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
I think you're touching on a number of different issues. One of them is transitional justice. People are forcibly displaced. They spend a considerable amount of time somewhere else. They return to their home country. The country is in serious difficulty, but sometimes they return to the country and their homes are being occupied by others. Mm-hmm. And if you look at statistics and studies that have been done in terms of civil wars, and I did mention that in terms of the DRC, you have peace agreements, but how long does the peace last? And the number one predictor in terms of where civil wars are going to take place is in countries that have experienced civil wars. So it's a very difficult problem, because you can have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, you can have forgiveness, but these things are very difficult to resolve and take time. And then, of course, if there isn't support outside in terms of economic development and humanitarian assistance, it makes it that much more difficult.
Thank you, James.
Anybody else want to talk? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So is there anybody in the audience? Yeah, James, please. Yeah, you have a question?
I have two questions, one for Maureen and then another question for Tracey. So Maureen, you mentioned that many of the refugee lawyers are now challenging in the courts C-12 and a number of other programs introduced by the current government what do you think are the prospects in terms of getting positive judgments from the courts with respect to those? And then, Tracey, I have a question for you as well. Will the UNHCR be providing amicus briefs in support of these challenges? And if so, which ones?
Okay, so thanks, James. And yeah, interesting second question from our perspective. So one thing that we're noticing with these comprehensive legal challenges is that the government is using more and more legal tools to put up obstacles for the actual merits of the case to be heard by the judge. So, for example, if an organization becomes a public interest litigant, right? So the Canadian Association of Refugee Lawyers or the Canadian Council for Refugees or Amnesty International, the government will challenge their standing as a party. When the government does that, they have to bring a motion. There has to be a response, a reply, often because the consequence is significant. It's an in-person hearing, and then the judge will reserve and make a decision. That kind of procedure could tie up a case for at least 6 months, right? And that's not the only kind of motion that can be brought. So I don't think any of us would bring the legal challenges if we didn't think that there was merit to them. Our biggest concern is not the merits of the case per se. It's how long is it going to take to get into court and have the matter heard? An example is the Safe Third Country Agreement litigation that I'm involved in on the Canadian government's obligation to conduct a continuing review of the designation of the US as a safe country. We filed our notice of application in January 2024. It's now almost July 2026. We're at the earliest stages of litigation. Now we're arguing with the government about privilege it's claimed because it says we can't give you any documents at all, nothing about about our rationale for why the US remains safe. Right. So we can't get anywhere in some of these cases. And that's, I think, what we're dealing with.
Thanks, Maureen. Yeah. So we are working closely with the lawyers, Maureen and others who are working on these cases. We are tracking closely. We're discussing with our headquarters different aspects of different cases and potential intervention. We have been intervening more frequently in the past year or two than we did before. When we intervene, what I can tell you is that it's based on international human rights or humanitarian law. That's the only place that we intervene in court cases in whatever country we're in. So we're looking at it. The perfect example, to just give you an example, is the Safe Third Country Agreement. We would not typically intervene in something like that because those are bilateral agreements. Despite our views or how we see things, typically we would not intervene on such a case. However, a case of the most recent one we've intervened on was the Kenyinda case, which actually turned out to be positive for the individual and demonstrated, that women deserve the right to childcare, and not getting it was actually a hindrance to them getting a job and having a life here in Canada. So I don't know if we're looking at them. I think it's very probable we might intervene if some of these cases go forward, but we do not have any active ones at the moment.
Okay, so we have 4 minutes to go, but are there any questions? last questions maybe we can take, and then we move. I'll hand over to James for yeah. So before okay, so there okay no there is no other questions so far. Okay, so before I hand over to James for concluding, I wanna on behalf of CARFMS, I would like to thank our three esteemed scholars, speakers, Tracy, James, and Maureen, for sharing their insightful comments, commentaries, reflections, and facts, actually. And thank you to all of you who joined us today and contributed to questions. So what strikes me actually, or most of us about today's conversations and the report about the numbers that tell part of the story, as Maureen mentioned, but we actually went into the depth of what they mean. I know one thing came to my mind, like, okay, there was a very significant, like it was, the report started with the decline, right? As what that number mean. And later I found that that is because of the returnees. But there are durable solutions, but the progress is actually not based on those solutions. It's rather those returns were involuntary. So there are a lot of actually things to think of based on the report. And this discussion reminds us that while statistics help us understand the scale of forced displacement, they ultimately represent the lives of millions of people seeking safety, dignity, and lasting solution. And thank you all for participating, and we hope to see you at future events. And I would like to announce our next CARFMS webinar would be with doctoral and graduate students webinar that will be on September 29th, Tuesday, and we will be actually announcing it through our social media and website. And now I would like to hand over to James for concluding the sessions. Thank you.
Let me add my thanks to everyone as well, to our two wonderful presenters, Maureen Silgoff, Tracey Maulfair. And I also wanted to thank Aziz for chairing the session. Thank you very much, Aziz. And thank you, Michelle Millard, for the poster and supporting us for this Zoom seminar. And thank you, everyone, for attending. We had, I think, a really solid turnout. And as Aziz has pointed out, we have a number of webinars that are coming up. Please look for those. September 29th, 3:30 p.m. is going to be our CARFMS PhD student seminar, but we have some others planned as well. Look at our website for those coming up. And I want to put a plug in for our next CARFMS 27 conference that will be held May 12th to the 14th. Please pencil that into your calendars. The call for papers is already up on our website. It'll take place in Winnipeg at the University of Manitoba at St. John's College. And thank you, everyone. We hope to see you at our next webinar.